Okay, hi everybody, welcome and good afternoon. I'm Dan HoSang. I teach in American Studies and Ethnicity, Race, and Migration at Yale. I want to, first, before we introduce the panels, thank everyone for your continued energy. Sustaining a conversation like this so that we don't just drop in and off for one paper, but think about the collective process of reflection and engagement is so important to this space. So as lovely as it is outside, it's also lovely in here, and I really want to thank and acknowledge and appreciate people for that. I was thinking yesterday about one of the great things about staying with all the papers is the way it allowed us to move across the specificity of time and place, thinking about national context in certain periods and how we might kind of bridge that with larger narratives. And I think our three papers today are cueing us to do exactly that. Keep both in mind, particularities and continuities, as we try to synthesize the last 2 days of work. So I'll introduce the three speakers. They'll do their papers, then we'll have some time for questions. First is Brendan McGeever, who is a lecturer in the sociology of racialization and antisemitism at Birkbeck, University of London. He's also acting associate director of the Peers Institute for the Study of Antisemitism, and the author of a book called The Bolsheviks and Antisemitism in the Russian Revolution, 1917 to 1919. And his paper is titled Brexit, Class, Racism, and Crisis. Then we'll hear from Ferruh Yılmaz, who is currently an associate professor in the communication department at Tulane University in New Orleans. He previously worked as a journalist for a number of news organizations in Britain, Denmark, and Turkey. He's the author of a relatively recent book called How the Workers Became Muslim, Immigration, Culture, and Hegemonic Transformation in Europe, which I just learned won an award from, book award from one of the sections of the International Communication Association, so congratulations. His paper is titled The Elite and Media Response to Populist Interventions. And finally, we're really pleased to welcome David Seymour from the City Law School, University of London. David has written broadly about cultural theories, understanding, and critique of antisemitism, and his current research project addresses the rise of populism and its threats to the rule of law, equality, and social and political rights. And he has a new title for his paper. It's Populism, Elite Theory, and Its Critique. So please join me now in welcoming Brendan McGeever.
Thank you, Daniel, and I want to thank Maury and Steve as well for inviting me to speak at this important event, which could not be more timely or urgent, because we gather here today at a historic moment in the history of Britain and of Europe more generally. The neoliberal settlement, crafted over 3 decades by conservative and social democratic parties across Europe, now lies in tatters, torn asunder by the most sustained economic depression since the 1930s. From Sweden to Switzerland, Belgium to Bulgaria, a tide of reactionary populism has been sweeping across the European mainland, a tide which demands nothing less than a restoration of a mythical golden age of sovereign nation states defined by cultural and racial homogeneity. Now, Britain has not been inoculated from the turbulence created by this decade-long and still unfinished crisis of late capitalism. The most striking manifestation of this, of course, has been Brexit. Now, the talk I'm giving this afternoon is based on an article that I've written with Satnam Virdi from the University of Glasgow, which has just been published in the journal Ethnic and Racial Studies. And what I want to do over the next 20 minutes or so is give an account of Brexit that places questions of race, empire, class, and crisis centre stage. I'll begin by mapping out some of the discursive dimensions of the Brexit campaign, and I will close by offering a more structural analysis that suggests and offers an argument for why the Brexit narrative found such traction and why it is spoken to so many people. Just a couple of things before we get started. The case for Brexit was built around 2 distinct organisations: Vote Leave The official Leave campaign, which was made up of right-wing Conservative politicians, such as Boris Johnson. The second, unofficial campaign was Leave EU, and this was led by the far-right party UKIP and its then leader Nigel Farage. A defining slogan of the Vote Leave campaign was, "Let's take back control." Now, this deceptively simple demand was one that spoke, on the face of it, to issues of sovereignty and democracy. But it was an argument deeply entwined with the politics of race. And the first thing to mention here is empire. For Vote Leave advocates like Boris Johnson, the Brexit project was bound up in the re-establishment of long-standing ties with kith and kin from the old Commonwealth of Canada, Australia, New Zealand, as well as the US. And what attracted many Conservative politicians to Brexit was this idea of a revived Anglosphere. Liberated from the EU, Britain would now be able to assert itself once again on the world stage. Indeed, we need only cast our minds back to the discursive register used by Prime Minister Theresa May in her first address after Brexit, given in January this year, when she used the phrase, "a truly global Britain," no less than 19 times. Now, in a country with a history such as Britain's, you cannot project a truly global Britain without drawing on those deep reservoirs, those deep-seated imperial residues, those nostalgics in search of a lost empire that continue to shape the collective conscience of a large section of the majority population. Now, just to give you a little flavour of this, just before the referendum, UKIP, the far-right party I mentioned earlier, released a statement saying, and I quote, "Outside of the EU, the world is our oyster, and the Commonwealth, the peril within." And last year, during post-Brexit trade negotiations with the Commonwealth, Whitehall officials described these discussions as, I quote, "Empire 2.0. And earlier this year, one Conservative minister described Brexit as a strengthening of the white Commonwealth. This was off the record, I should add. Now, given this fanciful ambition to embark on a new global adventure with the British state as primus inter pares, one might have expected Vote Leave campaigners to have undertaken at least some reckoning with the underside of the actual British imperial project of yesteryear. An acknowledgement, perhaps, of colonial subjugation, of the scars, material and psychic, which have been left on those stigmatised populations over the course of 4 centuries. Not a single word has been spoken to that effect. Instead, what makes this project of a new global Britain so alluring is precisely its erasure of the racist underside of the actual empire project of yesteryear. So the campaign for Brexit, then, effected an artificial rupture between Britain's historical past and its possible future. That is to say, Brexit draws on deep reservoirs of imperial longing in the majority population. So the Vote Leave campaign, in many ways then, was an exemplar of what Paul Gilroy spoke of as post-colonial melancholy, a narrative crafted by and for those who have still not come to terms with the loss of empire and the resulting decline that Britain has undergone since decolonisation. Brexit invoked warm collective memories of a now lost world where Britain was the global hegemon of the capitalist world economy. Those glory days when everything from ships to spoons were marked with a Made in Britain stamp. The colonial flag may have been pulled down in every corner of the globe, as Stuart Hall once said, but it still flies in the collective unconscious. But running alongside this fantasy of re-establishing Britain as a global hegemon, this vision as Britain as the best in the world, was another set of narratives articulated by the key leaders of the second unofficial Leave campaign. leave EU. Their vision was a different one, of an insular British nationalism. Britain for the British. And at the heart of this was a set of concerns around immigration. According to Nigel Farage, the then leader of UKIP and the figurehead of Leave EU, the EU had done great harm to Britain by facilitating uncontrolled immigration, thereby suppressing wages, a familiar narrative. The Brexit campaign to get our borders back, to get our democracy back, to take our country back, was underscored then by a racialised vision of restricting the entry of undesirables to make Britain safe again. And this reached its crescendo just days before the EU referendum, when Farage stood behind this breaking point poster, which depicted apparently Middle Eastern refugees queuing up at Europe's borders. The subheading, if you can see it, read, "We must break free of the EU and take back control." Now, unlike the imperial fantasies of the official Leave campaign, this was a vision of island retreat, of pulling up the proverbial drawbridge. And as many pointed out, the image seemed to be pulled straight out of the archive of National Socialism. More broadly, however, the breaking point poster can only be understood against the backdrop of the way immigration to Britain over the last century has been politicised and racialised. Throughout the course of the 20th century, from the arrival of Jewish migrants from Tsarist Russia to the migration of Caribbean and Asian migrants, there's always been a sustained cross-class coalition of social forces that have opposed their presence in Britain. Whether they were deemed to not be Christian, as in the case of the Jews, or not white, in the case of Asians and Caribbeans, the British nation has long been constructed in such a way that its borders have been racialised in the public imagination. And this is what the Leave campaigners understood, in a way much of the mainstream media did not. Because this history of immigration to Britain has been so thoroughly racialised over time that a reservoir of unconscious racism could be activated merely through the production of appropriately framed and coded language. To put this another way around, people like Nigel Farage are able to obey the formal rules of post-racism, while at the same time signalling to their intended public that they do indeed represent the best chance of securing the old project of keeping the nation Christian and white. So what underscored Brexit then, I want to suggest, were two interlocking, but actually quite contradictory racialising visions. One, an expansionist imperial fantasy that sat alongside another, which was more insular, a project of island retreat. Now, if confirmation were needed that Brexit was intimately bound up with race, it was provided in the wave of racist hate that was unleashed in the days and weeks following the referendum result. A report in July last year showed that 6,000 racist hate crimes were reported to the National Police Chiefs Council in the 4 weeks following the Brexit result. In fact, in the 4 days following the Brexit result, reports of racist hate crime rose by 57%. Now, the racism of post-Brexit Britain has its moorings, not just in the aching loss of empire, but in the structural decline that Britain has undergone since the onset of neoliberalism in the late 70s. The discourses of the Leave campaign that I've described so far assert themselves today against a backdrop of Britain's comparatively marginal position in the world economy. We're talking here about the story of decline. And decline is important for understanding the politics of the current conjuncture, because decline has also been accompanied by defeat. Defeat of the labour and social movements of the 1980s. Defeats that have left a working class profoundly disaggregated by region, nation, ethnicity, and so on. In fact, the period of working class defeat under Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was accompanied by another loss, the loss of alternative class frames of resistance, including those that were capable of imagining the working class as multi-ethnic and not just white. Let's go back a little bit further. After 1945, there was a historic post-war settlement in Britain that Labour, to a limited degree, would be protected from capital. I'm talking here about the NHS and the welfare state, of course. And what neoliberalism did, however, was to take on and reverse that post-war settlement. Under Conservative rule in the 1980s, the politics of class, even the language of class and class solidarity, were significantly weakened. And these defeats, in turn, profoundly diminished those countercurrents of anti-racist politics, including those aligned to the politics of blackness. This is the backdrop to the racialised class politics of the current moment. What has happened in recent years is that the prospect, and in fact the reality, of downward mobility has produced class injuries and collective experiences that have been recast through the politics of ressentiment. Although decline is necessarily a multi-ethnic process, it is experienced in a racialised frame and is increasingly responded to by sections of the majority population through the politics of resentful nationalism, particularly English nationalism. And large-scale sociological survey data actually bears this out. What are the drivers of Englishness and English identification today? Euroscepticism and concern about immigration. This kind of ressentiment is no longer defined by imperial prowess or superiority, but by a deep sense of loss of prestige, a retreat from the damaging impact of a globalised world that is no longer recognisable, a world that is no longer British. To put it another way around, the decline of empire has not led to the overcoming of the English imperial complex, but rather its retraction into a defensive, exclusionary imaginary. We are under siege. It is time to pull up the drawbridge. And as I mentioned earlier, this was one of the defining features in the discursive architecture of the Leave campaign. But there's something else to say here. Brexit may have acted as an accelerant on those conditions that have allowed racism to flourish, but it did not create them. Instead, they were birthed not just under Thatcherism, but also the era of New Labour as well. Like other social democratic parties in Europe, Labour has been complicit in the consolidation of the racialisation of the nation, and particularly the consolidation of a new racialised enemy within, the Muslim. There are numerous examples in this long and sorry tale, but I'll just give you one or two from recent years. On your screen here you can see Gordon Brown, who in 2007 as Prime Minister demanded, I quote, "British jobs for British workers," a slogan previously owned by the far right. And then in 2015, Labour leader Ed Miliband continued the downward spiral of racialising national politics by pledging to control immigration. And in fact, in quintessential British style, it was put on a Labour campaign mug for drinking your tea in the morning. Controls on immigration. Across the spectrum, then, from New Labour to Conservative, a powerful narrative has become dominant. A narrative that describes the principal losers of globalisation as the white working class. Now, over the course of this decade-long crisis, the category of white working class is the frame through which many men and women now understand and make sense of their lives and the real pain that they suffer. A racialised frame of white working class victimhood has emerged. This category, white working class, elides the fact that it is, of course, the brown and black members of the working class who have been disproportionately hit by the politics of austerity and decline. But when most commentators, and there are a lot of them, who talk about the working class or the left behind, a phrase that's come to prominence of late, what they have in mind is a racialised class subject, the white working class. So this category of the white working class in recent times in Britain has been brought to life such that it now has a material force within everyday social relations. And we see this in the racist blowback that has followed the Brexit result of June 2016. Now, I'm reminded of the fact that the social theorist Raymond Williams once remarked, "To be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing." Well, this has been a despairing talk, so where might we locate some resources of hope? Well, potential collective agents against racism in Britain today are not easily identifiable, but I do want to sketch a tentative portrait of two possible anti-racist agents. First, deposited in the minority populations of England in particular are memories of collective resistance. Any post-Brexit pushback against the racialising, narrowing or exclusionary framing of Englishness will likely involve those who incur its injuries. It seems a banal point to make, but one worth making. Second, in a more everyday sense, there is hope to be found in the very fact of multi-ethnic contemporary life in Britain. To put this in a straightforward way, we're just much more entangled in each other's lives than was once the case. Nearly 1 in 10 people in England and Wales are involved in what are termed mixed relationships, and nearly half of those involve people from the majority white population. So the retreat of collectivism that has come to define the neoliberal era has also been accompanied by the emergence of an everyday multicultural reality, particularly among younger generations. Those who are under 35 years old, who grew up in the slipstream of the anti-racist struggles of the 70s and 80s, encounter a Britain today transformed by the very real gains of the anti-racist movements that preceded them. Talking here about equality provisions at work, multicultural education in schools, an anti-racist civic culture, and so on. However much these gains are being rolled back by the austerity programme of the current government, their imprint is traceable in the ease with which many young people just handle the lived realities of multi-ethnic life in Britain, especially in England. In this sense, the anti-racist victories of the past have their returns in the present, even though the political conjuncture could not be more different. But this everyday multicultural sensibility that sociologists such as Paul Gilroy have celebrated has not, I would argue, really been tested in a political sense. It's not clear how durable the lived multiculture produced in the aftermath of the anti-racism of the 70s and the 80s will actually prove to be, particularly when in an era such as this, when the racist right is in the ascendancy and the infrastructures of anti-racist resistance are in long-term retreat. So there are resources of hope, but time is running out. We are at 5 minutes to midnight. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to talk about higher microphone. Okay. We've heard a lot of excellent and interesting presentations about racism, race, anti-Semitism, populism, fascism, that dealt with those objects. I'm going to talk about something a bit different, our responses to those things, and how our responses actually somehow confirm what they are saying and what they are doing, and then strengthen them. So, do you remember the case where the scandal when Trump's sexist talk about women, where he was talking about how he was groping them, came up? Everybody in my surroundings said, he's done. The media said that too. I turned to my wife. She's there. I said, no, he's not. Why did I know he's not? Because the populist logic is well equipped to deal with these things. It anticipates it. Soon, that was the image that was circulating on social media. You haven't seen it? That happens not because she actually, I don't think she means it, but that is how Trump's supporters reacted to it, because not only did he survive the scandal, nothing changed. Nobody who supported Trump actually dropped him because of this. It's because the populist rhetoric, the populist logic, as it were, especially in its right-wing variants. I will be talking about mostly right-wing populism, not left-wing populism. I haven't studied that much. Anticipates this kind of elite hubris. So this brings me what I'm going to talk about today. Our responses to whatever they are saying actually feeds right into populist rhetoric. Whenever somebody is trying to say something, express people's real concerns, they will be attacked by the elite, by the intellectuals, the government, the media, and they do. The supporters do see them as oppression of the oppression of expression of people's real concerns. So it doesn't matter. She may even hate Trump for sexist speech, but she will still defend him. The second is, the right-wing populists usually incite the discourse about certain issues, and our responses actually focus on those issues. And by doing that, not only do we confirm populist arguments about elite hubris, but we also concede the ground on which the struggle takes place. Which brings me to my third point. We end up sedimenting the terms, the categories, the concepts through which we think and practice the social. Let me start with the first point. According to the populist logic, one of the sins of the elite is that they act as if they own the public discourse, public debate, and decide what can be said, what cannot be said. Consequently, any attack by the establishment is an attempt to silent dissent against the system. In that sense, populist leaders, and not only Trump, Wallace before him, love when they are attacked. They turn it around and use it in their logic as a confirmation that whatever they have been saying about the corrupt system has been confirmed by those attacks. I've seen many interviews with people who support Trump, and a woman was saying, for example, I'm afraid to say what I really feel because it's not politically correct. So political correctness becomes a tool to oppress dissent. The mainstream media may find those ideas outrageous, but they love controversies. So they provide ample space for these arguments, for these controversies, and when repeated enough, these ideas, when they are repeated enough, they become, so to say, gentrified. They become part of the mainstream. It's now a legitimate concern. Just look at what CBS chairman and CEO said. Trump may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. I don't know if you have seen it before. I've never seen anything like this, and this is going to be a very good year for us. Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Keep going. So how media works and how they react to it, feed into it too. It opens up space. So that the media love controversy, I want to show you a clip from Jon Stewart.
Of course, the media was very circumspect about whether or not they should even be covering these provocative acts perpetrated by propagandizing pyromaniac proselytizers. Perhaps they shouldn't. But this next clip exemplifies how often the media's better angels get the kicked out of them.
This guy is clown of the earth, and we shouldn't be having a conversation about what he is or he isn't going to do. I mean, we can't address all these whack jobs throughout the country. But there's a second side of this, Chris, that's really important. The rest of the world, the Muslim world...
I've got to interrupt you because here's the pastor. Let's hear what he has to say.
And the winner and still undefeated champion in the battle between the media's superego and id is id. Poor media. They can't help themselves. They're not bad people. You know what the media is? They're the dog from the movie Up.
My master made me this collar. He is a good and smart master, and he made me this collar so that I may talk. Squirrel!
So, let's see. Pastor Terry Jones, I don't know if you remember him. He was a pastor, a far-right figure who was even estranged from his congregation. But with this, he became world famous. And suddenly, his arguments were all over the places. And he was speaking to those who may have thought the same things but weren't sure. Suddenly, it was there in all the media all the time, even if it were negative. So what happens is, let me play this one now. The media reacts.
Just so you know, Wikipedia, I made up that last part. All right. When we last left you, there was still some uncertainty as to how Americans would be reflecting on the 9th anniversary of 9/11. Well, specifically, how one American out of 350 million or so, Terry Jones, pastor of Gainesville's Dove World Outreach Center and president of Gainesville's Upper Lip Hair Club for Men, how he would be observing that day.
Will he burn the Quran with his followers?
Why is it that Muslims are in such an uproar about burning the Quran?
Just how kooky is this guy?
Is he going to start burning the Torah next?
What? No! Torah! Burn bad!
So this one brings me to my third point, which is, did you notice they were asking why are Muslims so upset about it? Would anybody ask anything like that to other religious or political groups? Suddenly it becomes, like, I don't know who that guy was and who he represented, but there was a Muslim thing and there was a representative. Suddenly it became into a category that you can deal with. So that is one of my points. It's not that focus on far-right rhetoric and populist rhetoric means that we accept their messages, but we concede the ground on which the struggle takes place, and then we also, and this is the third point, accept the terms with which we talk about it. And let me give you an example from my own, an anecdote from my own life. A couple of months ago, I was invited to speak at a sponsored panel about Trump's victory, and it was sponsored by the academic organization, a huge academic organization. The chairman said, we need somebody who speaks of or from the Muslim perspective. And I wrote back, I'm not doing that. But the point is, why did she suddenly assume that first, there was a Muslim perspective that one can speak of or from. What would that be? And the second is that I can speak of or from that perspective. So suddenly we are dealing, as she, as an academic, I am not an academic anymore. I'm of another category. So having said these things, I want to talk about my research that I did in Europe, especially about Denmark, where there was a populist intervention in the mid-'80s and how it worked. It created a great controversy, but at the end, they won, even though they had lost the single battle. So, let me see, the case of Denmark. And this is the book that I have been talking about, so I'm going to talk about the research from the book. So Denmark is one of the first countries where the populist far right successfully intervened in discourse with a nationalist and anti-Muslim rhetoric and gained immediate audibility as early as the mid-'80s. What led to their success was an intervention by a priest called Søren Krag in 1986, which changed the focus of populist far-right forces from high taxes to immigration, especially Muslim immigration, as the biggest threat to the nation and to the working class. It came in the form of two newspaper ads in September 1986. He and a small group of people around him successfully created a huge controversy by saying these things, by calling a boycott of an iconic humanitarian fundraising campaign for refugees. It was called Refugee 86. He claimed to be speaking on behalf of silent majority who, he said, were deeply concerned about the future of their nation. The corrupt cosmopolitan elite were about to destroy the nation by letting Muslim immigrants flooding the country and destroying it. He asked the Danes boycott Refugee 86 as a way of resisting the elite Denmark. So this is an abbreviated form of that ad. You can see what he's saying there. The question is then, why would this argument by a relatively unknown priest and columnist, who was known mostly for his extremist, homophobic, and misogynistic views, have so much impact on discourse? Couldn't he easily be dismissed and rendered irrelevant? That's where the rhetorical strategies come in. And I think by talking about those rhetorical strategies, I'm hoping to create a kind of a map that will give us an understanding of how our reactions fit into it or don't fit into it. So the first strategy is creating a controversy as a way of opening up the discourse for themselves, even if the controversy is not favorable to them. So he was able to create a controversy. As soon as you create a controversy, as we have seen with Terry Jones, you become the main protagonist, even if you are criticized. So the ads and the following fulmination immediately brought him into the center of debate, heated debate. The media coverage was extensive. He received an incredible amount of space in which he promoted his arguments. Very few people had seen the ads. Within a couple of days, everybody in Denmark knew what he was saying, every single person. And of course, not surprisingly, his ads brought the entire establishments together. The mainstream left and right, labor unions, employers, artists, writers, intellectuals of all sorts, and of course the media. How could they not? Refugee Council was composed of representatives from different humanitarian organizations. So as such, it represented the humanitarian self-image of Denmark. So it seemed inevitable that it will create animosity against him. So they thought the most effective strategy was to accuse him of racism. Just like George Wallace in the States, or Enoch Powell in Britain, he cleverly turned around these accusations and used them as a proof that the cosmopolitan elite were indeed terrorizing Danish people, and that racism was an effective tool in dismissing people's concerns. So it became one of the central tools in his strategy of polarizing the debate and channeling the resentment against refugees into a general dissent against the political and cultural establishment, as well as the political representation system, which something I call a hegemonic crisis. Another rhetorical strategy was constructing people through the figure of silent majority. This is so generic, actually, for almost all populist movements. So what it does is it allowed him to present himself as the brave man who spoke on behalf of those oppressed majorities. Since they were silent, he dared to speak up. His articulation of those concerns became de facto concerns of those concerns. Actually, I read a lot of letters to the editors in that time. People did not talk about Muslim occupation. They talk about money. We can't afford so many people. What are we going to do? We don't have housing. They get bicycles. We don't get bicycles. That kind of stuff. And there were now and then expressions of Islamophobia, but they were not the main concern. But he said, forget about all that money stuff. We are talking about the future of nation. And that became the tacit definition of the problem. So here's the twist, though. He did not really focus on those concerns in these ads. Instead, he directed the attention of his opponents to something else. He attacked a humanitarian aid campaign that had nothing to do with Danish immigration policies. The money to be collected were to be used for refugees abroad, not refugees who had already arrived in Denmark. So this was the greatest rhetorical trap, and the opponents swallowed the bait without thinking twice. It seemed easy to defeat him on that ground. By taking the bait, the opponents involuntarily admitted that the aid campaign as the battleground. So money collection thus became the sole criterion for success. It had to succeed. So in hindsight, how could they avoid it? A failure in money collection would be seen as disapproval of immigration laws and policies, and in general as a confidence vote on the political representation system. So by making money collection as the main criteria for success, what they did is they let his basic claim go unchallenged. The logic was this: even if people were dissatisfied with immigration policy, they could still donate money, since the task is to help refugees abroad, not in Denmark. So, okay, I did not. So the leader of the Refugee Council, the main nemesis of him, said, it's probably correct that people are not happy about the refugee influx to Denmark, but then they should be more willing to contribute because the task is to help refugees out in the world. Almost everybody repeated this argument. So the opponents were exactly where Crowd would have them. They accepted the claim that the immigration policy was immensely unpopular, and they also accepted that immigration was not only a question of economic burden on poor people, but a question of a threat, cultural threat to the nation. By not challenging him on this premise, they granted him free hands to articulate what unpopularity meant, that Danes were concerned about the future of their nation. This became the definition of the problem. Of course, the collection was a relative success. The goal was reached. Even the foreign minister from the mainstream right was among the volunteers who collected money. But does it mean that he was really defeated? On the contrary, since the mid-80s, Muslim immigration, their cultural incompatibility with Danish society, and the threat they pose to the welfare system, and everything else we have been fighting for, among others, gender equality, freedom of speech, tolerance for gays, whatever you can imagine as progressive, they were a threat to that. So the far-right sustained campaign, it didn't stop here, on the impact of Muslim immigration has moved the political focus from class to culture as the natural ground on which solidarities are rooted. Consequently, the strange bedfellows have emerged, as I said. Even the left and many progressive movements accepted the premise that the future of the nation depends on a successful defense of the core values of the nation threatened by Islam. Let me show you. This is a logo that one of the most liberal newspapers in Denmark that has always been against far-right and against Islamophobia uses when they have a theme about immigration. Try to see what's going on. The constellation. Women with headscarf as opposed to emancipated women, and emancipation signified by little clothes. The same here. There's an abundance of these pictures whenever there's a story about immigration. So immigrants became Muslims. They were guest workers. They were workers. As workers, they were part of the working class in Denmark. As Muslims, they are not part of anything anymore. They are alien. They are outside of society. They are not part of the ontological structure of society. So this is what happened. And these pictures were from 90s and 2000s. And this is, fast forward 2015, Danish Social Democratic Prime Minister in her election campaign, she says, if you come to Denmark, you have to work. Refugees and immigrants on social help have to work. I want a collectivity where everybody contributes to it. So they are speaking the same language now. This is social democracy. This is not far right. And this is actually the left-wing response to it. If you come to Denmark, you have to pay taxes. So they were trying to challenge, and then I must say, I've seen Ho was showing some statistics yesterday, and it seemed as if the far right is not successful. It is actually, it's the second biggest party, but because of the representation system, which is where the level is 2% only, you have a lot of parties. They are the second biggest party. And not only that, they actually have an enormous impact on how we think about society. But the left wing, who never went over 4% with this, they came up to 8 or 9%. So there is a polarization. So my time is up, but I want to wrap up with one paragraph. That is, when we respond to populist logic or populist rhetoric, we always respond with facts and rationality. Politics is not always about rational deliberation. It is actually, as we think usually, it is an investment in identity categories. And how we think of identity is usually about solidarity. Who and with whom and about what do we forge solidarities with people? And how is it defined, those interests that around which we can forge solidarities? Of course, by the adversary who is preventing us from achieving those ends. So depending on who the adversary is, and in this case it's immigrants, then the solidarities are forged on the basis of cultural sameness, nationality, race. Race is not a big thing in Denmark, it's culture. So with that, I will end, and I hope that this can provide us with some kind of map where we understand how the populist logic works and how we can respond to it. Thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to thank all the organisers for the conference. Someone said about a successful conference is you meet old friends, you make new friends, and you learn something, in which point this has been the perfect conference. Being last of the panel of the conference has its disadvantages. I was going to give up smoking. It has its advantages in that it gives me an opportunity where I think I see it of connecting with other papers. So in a way, it's been quite a good thing. And especially this panel, I think my work fits in nicely with the two previous papers. I'll read to start with anyway. Despite the varying divergences within the literature on populism, there is almost unanimous agreement that at its poles it contains two components, the elite and the people. Kasmad formulates it as follows: populism says something about the relationship between the elite and the people. This paper explores these three elements of populism: the elite, the people, and the relationship. However, it does so not like most recent literature from that of the people, but from the perspective of the elite. I think it's from that perspective that some new light can be thrown on the phenomenon of populism. Moreover, I've chosen three critical works to throw light on this question. I argue that the trouble with a lot of the critique of populism is that we accept too much of their concepts and of their narrative, that we are not critical enough. So in a way, this piece that I'm presenting today is a gloss on Fackenheim's 614th commandment, which is don't give any victories to the reactionaries. As I say, it's a gloss. I argue that these critiques remain in thrall to the phenomena that they're investigating. They accept at face value rather than challenge the claim of populism's image of the demise of the meaningfulness of representative democracy and the social relations on which it's premised. Yet despite that, I argue that the critics themselves have something important to say. The three works I've selected, or rather revisited, are what I think are three of the best works of elite theory, which is Dialectic of Horkheimer. Adorno would love that. Dialectic of Enlightenment by Adorno and Horkheimer, The Power Elite, 1956 by C. Wright Mills, and Ralph Miliband's, Ed's dad, in The State and Capitalist Society in 1969. This isn't part of the presentation, but in the actual paper, it's not just a substantive link in terms of their work, but there is an academic biographical link between all three, which is quite interesting to find. So the first section, the ambivalence of the elite within the current literature on populism. As I've noted, most contemporary work on populism has focused on the notion of the people. One of the consequences of this focus is the seeming ambivalence toward the related and often mentioned concept of the elite. This ambivalence expresses itself in its slippage between being portrayed as the invention of the populist imagination and its supposed existence as a concrete reality of the nature of modern politics and governance. This turns in the case in Jan Werner Muller's recent book, What is Populism? He identifies what he sees as populism's three inherent criteria: anti-elitism, anti-pluralism, and an exclusionary identitarian notion of the people. Yet for him, anti-elitism barely is worth reflection. In fact, he naturalizes concepts of the elite as part of the functioning of modern politics. As he says, I argue that it is a necessary but not sufficient condition to be critical of elites in order to count as a populist. Otherwise, anyone criticizing the status quo would by definition be a populist. Also, virtually every presidential candidate would be a populist if criticism of existing elites is all there is to populism. After all, everyone runs against Washington. Likewise, Cass Mudd, from the same work where he makes the definition of the people and the elite, at times the elite appears in inverted commas, as if a false concept or a false construct in the mind of populism, and at other times he treats it as an actually existing thing. Yet, so what I find about the critiques of populism is when they refer to the elite, it already grants too much explanatory power to the populist imagination. Indeed, it grants too much power to that which it should be fundamentally challenging. What I'll do now is very briefly go through elite theory and the relationship of power that unites it with the people. Writing of elites' origins in the late 19th century, Geraint Parry notes its correspondent to two important aspects of the rise of what came to be termed the administrative state. The first was the expansion of the franchise and the rise of mass politics, and the second was the expansion of the state's role in almost all aspects of a citizen's life. Taken together, these two developments created an increasingly powerful executive along with an expanded, centralized bureaucracy able to fulfill that new role of the state. But for present purposes, what is important to note is this early elite theory claimed to identify the locus of real power. They said this is where the real power lays in the body politic. That is, with the unelected executive and its bureaucracy, rather than in the institutions, processes, and interests represented in the corresponding democratic institutions. Likewise, along with the content of elite theory, was its adoption of a positivist methodology, which I won't go into too deeply, but they literally posited this location of real power and so on and so forth. And we get that today in some elite theory work that's being written now. Taken together, therefore, a picture of elite theory emerges that bears a striking resemblance to the image of what populists say is the true nature of the modern body politic. No longer explicable in terms of the relationship of state and civil society and the social relations that give meaning to both their form and their content, the image for both is a form of governance that is said or posited to be in the hands of the few, the elite, and stripped bare of what they see as an empty facade of democratic ornamentation, has the almost omnipotent power, the relationship, in order to, so as to order the now passive lives of the many, i.e. the people. The three critical counts I mentioned above appear at first sight to reject such a positive reading of elite theory. They're more sensitive to the temporal, historical, and social movements that bring the elites into power. Yet despite such sensitivity, the picture of the populist imagination is replicated. For Adorno and Horkheimer, the rise and power of the elite and corresponding decline and powerlessness of the non-elite emerges from the usurpation of the state by society's dominant ruling class, the bourgeoisie, brought about by the concentration of private property into the decreasing number of cartels and corporations. C. Wright Mills, who shares many of Adorno's and Horkheimer's thinking on this point, dates to these developments from the onset of the Cold War. However, unlike the Frankfurt thinkers, Mills does not claim that the state has disappeared, but rather, for all meaningful intents and purposes, comprises not only the industrial elite, but as we know, also the military and political elites. And following on from Mills, Miliband refers also to an economic elite, but one that shares the values and interests of a capitalist-infused state elite, where there is a meeting of minds. Notwithstanding the important differences between them, all three thinkers relate the rise and dominion or domination by the elite with the coming into the mass, or what in its populist version is the people. And here I want to draw on Brendan's work, which he just presented, on the racialization of that concept of the people. I think he's dead right, and I would like, when I speak of the people, I'd like to bear in mind Brendan's points on that. The point is expressed most clearly in The Power Elite, where Mills writes, "The rise of the power elite rests upon and in some ways is part of the transformation of the publics of America into a mass society." Mills explains the transformation from a liberal to a mass society, from a democratic to an elite understanding of society, in terms similar to Adorno and Horkheimer. I've got a list here. It's a fragmentation of the subjectivity due to division of labour, empty consumerism, the media, cheap television, consumerism, and so on and so forth. But taken together, for Mills and for Adorno, the effect of the rise of the elite is said to ensure that the non-elite internalise what Mills refers to as life adjustment, and to what Adorno and Horkheimer call more darkly subjects without subjectivity. To put the matter in other terms, the mass or the people are characterised by the hallmark of passivity and conformity. And again, Brendan mentioned Ressentiment. Ressentiment was mentioned yesterday. I can't remember who it was, forgive me. But when I was rereading this last night, ready for today, I remember Nietzsche's maxim, if that's the right aphorism, that man would rather will nothingness than not will at all. And I think that's relevant with this notion of passivity and conformity. If there is agreement between populism of a world divided between the elite and the people, and of critical theory or the critiques of it that see the world in a similar term, the elite and the mass, so too is there apparent agreement on the nexus of the relationship between the two. I knew I was hot, but really.
Okay. Sorry for that interruption. Thankfully, it was nothing serious, and thanks for sticking around. So here's what we're going to do. David is going to finish his paper. He'll recap a little bit to get us back in the mood. We'll have a short question period, and then we will go straight to the keynote after. So thank you, and here's David.
Thanks, okay. I've always wanted to do this. Previously. I'm expecting Kiefer Sutherland to run in now. The basic theme of the paper is that the critics of elite theory accept the structure of what they see as the political world as that between an almighty, omnipotent, powerful elite and a completely and utterly powerless, conforming mass, with real power in the hands of the few. And what I was going to now speak about is, once they've broken down that relationship between the elite and the people or the mass, the argument of the nexus of the relationship is pure power, unmediated power. So what I say here, just to find it, the nature of the relationship presented is stripped bare of any of its democratic aspects, legitimacy, authority, and is instead expressed through the positivism of power, or more likely, domination. And I go through, I won't bother with this, but I run through how that happens in Adorno and Horkheimer, where it's a unilateral form of power that molds the mass. And even though it's slightly more moderate in Mills, once again, everything is stripped bare. Democracies, representative institutions, notions of social interests, social relations are completely erased, which I argue is also at the heart of the populist imagination. I'll actually probably only be 5 minutes. So, I'll just finish with this bit about power. Despite the emphasis each places on the top-down direction of power as the nexus between elite and people, or the elite and the people, there's always a definitive article. All present that notion of power in a positivist, possessory manner, as little more than a zero-sum game of gains and losses, with the elite, the ultimate powerful winners, and the mass or the people, their ultimate powerlessness losers. So in keeping with the theme of the conference, what about racism? It's interesting to know that in these critiques of elite theory, there's very little discussion of racism other than in Dialectic of Enlightenment. As far as I'm aware, Mills does not mention racism at all in The Power Elite, and this is written in 1956, and it's only mentioned in passing in Miliband's The State in Capitalist Society. Yet where it is mentioned, especially in Dialectic of Enlightenment, racism and anti-Semitism is explained as not inherent in the relationship between the elite and the people, but rather as its byproduct. So for Adorno and Horkheimer, the passivity of the mass or the people turn into the racism of the people underneath the surface. It's presented through the prism of psychoanalysts. The Jews, in inverted commas, the concept of the Jews become, for the people, the embodiment of bourgeois subjectivity, the promise of freedom, individual agency, control over their own lives, which has to be repressed in order for the people, for individuals, subjects without subjectivity, to survive in the era of monopoly capitalism. Understood in these terms, therefore, embodying as embodiments of these very values or elements, the mere presence of, inverted commas, the Jews become a provocation for a present and a future emancipation that cannot be but endlessly deferred and denied. For Miliband, and again this taps on to Brendan's paper, for Miliband it's a failure and a frustration of an available and credible alternative to the way things are. A failure which he argues is brought about by social democratic, what he calls social democratic elites, adopting the values of contemporary capitalism, and which therefore leaves the ground free for a would-be demagogue to come along and make profit out of it. But what I argue is that these authors fail to recognise that racism, anti-Semitism, is not a byproduct of a system that's said to exist between the elite and the people or the mass, but rather it is inherent within that relationship. The critique of populism appears to accept the claims of the populist imagination in a manner that mythologizes the complexity of social and political relations so that political and social phenomena become reduced to seemingly the personal machinations of the few. It's precisely how populism describes it. It identifies people as the carriers of power. As the passivity and the powerlessness of the mass rearticulates itself as the power of the people, they cannot but imagine themselves victims of such personalized elites. Who the embodiment of such elites are will, of course, vary from time to time and place to place. Yet whoever is allocated this malevolent, almost omnipotent, if not magical power, they cannot be, and this taps into an earlier paper, Alexandra's I think, they cannot but be deemed as the enemies of the people, be they the cosmopolitan elite, the global elite. In England, we had a terrible headline where the judges of the Supreme Court were called the enemies of the people, the bankers, the Rothschilds, the lobby, and as we saw in an earlier paper, it's the elite, the personalized people of the elite who are blamed for bringing in the non-people as well. So it's always mediated through the elite. For populism and those of its critics, both of whom appear to share the same account of the reduction of the state and civil society to the elite and the people respectively, and who in so doing flatten out the contradictions and tensions inherent within both of the former concepts into opposing homogeneous groups, no other explanation remains. The conclusion. I'll only be a couple of minutes. Conclusion. In this paper, I've hoped to illustrate the ways in which the three critical accounts have accepted many of the fundamental assumptions of both elite theory and the role it plays in the populist imagination. In other words, that the critiques of populism have failed to obtain the necessary critical distance. Adopting the positivism of elite thinking, as I say, the state becomes the elite, civil society the mass or the people, and the relationship in terms of power. However, the correspondence between this critique of elite theory, and the populist imagination is not without its truth value. It tells us something about the times we are living in. There is little doubt that Adorno and Horkheimer, Mills and Miliband capture something real and tangible about the age in which they were writing and I am speaking. Yet their error, if I may call it that, was to present their theories as if they were examining blows of fate of which we are powerless to act. It's as if what the powerful were saying about their own power and the powerlessness and the powerless about their own absence of power was truly the case. Rather, I believe that each of these accounts express, again, this is pure coincidence, follows from Brendan's paper. Rather, I believe that each of these accounts express what we can call the politics of defeat and despair. They capture something tangible about the eras in which they were writing. They were periods of reaction, in which the political and social tide had turned against more progressive streams. The despair brought at these times appears in the content of the accounts of the world that is adopted by the forces of reaction themselves, and which, as we've seen, also inform the populist imagination. The demise of the democratic institutions and the conflictual social relations that sustain them, and their rise in their place of a mythological division between elite and mass, or the people. The despair also appears in its positivist framework, in which what perhaps can and should be seen as a temporary and reversible moment in the ebb and flow of social forces and social interests have become frozen, so that, to paraphrase Adorno and Horkheimer, it takes on the image of brute facts or blind fate, which we tell ourselves we are powerless to alter. This powerlessness pervades not only elite theory and the populist imagination, but also constrains the praxis of a democratic critique, a praxis in which we are all, by definition, invested and consequently responsible. That in the age of Trump and of Brexit, the temptation of populism to explain such an age should appear is hardly surprising. However, for those who oppose such explanations of the world, it is important that in not falling under populism's spell, we do not grant it the very power it grants to itself. Thank you.